Okay. So the book begins with the destruction of the Earth, and one of the early scenes is of the arrival of the Vogon constructor fleet sent to demolish Earth to make way for intergalactic bypass. And as the Vogon fleet passes over Earth, it doesn't create even a ripple in any of the astronomical centers that have been looking out for life out there in the rest of the universe. And Douglas Adams makes the comment that says, well, this was a pity, because it was exactly the sort of thing they've been looking for all these years. And I suppose I'd like to begin by arguing, and it's sort of like a criticism of my own subject of my own area of international relations, is in many respects, that's what international relations did too. It kind of missed the big one. It missed the Vogon constructor fleet, or rather it missed a series of crises. And a lot of that is really kind of tied up with the history of international relations, the history of international thought, the history of the way that we've looked at international relations. Basically, this is also the keynote. I wanted it also to be dealing with international thought and geopolitics, but kind of a riff on the conference theme. So, I'm not saying it's not a paper that's similar to other papers that have been presented, but it deals with many of the themes, I think, that have come up that people have talked about in their papers. And for me, the issue is this: how the history of IR meant we missed the bigger threats, and following on from this, what we can do about it. And it'll be in sort of three parts. What I intend to do specifically is, first of all, present you with a new way of looking at 20th century history of international thought, or IR, how we do global politics, to talk about the marginalization of materialist theories of global politics that from before 1950, from 1950, to reconstruct from this a kind of lost materialist tradition in IR, particularly one based around our perceptions of the world, and then to show, and this is the less formed part of the paper, show how it can help us understand global politics today. So let me start with the first part, and that's this story isn't true, to quote Socrates from the Phaedrus. There's a lot that we get wrong about the history of international thought in the 20th century, and these errors are repeated constantly in the textbooks that are brought out for first-year classes. First off, let me talk about there's an expected story of international relations origins, of political thought. And it kind of focuses around key dates like 1919. And of course, in the audience, we have two people who actually wrote a paper quite some time ago now, refuting 1919 and 1648 as dates. But yet, this sort of notion of 1919 as a key date continues within the discipline. The key thing here is that there's IR starts as idealism. It begins as wishful thinking, trying to eliminate war, and of course this does an important service in terms of making international relations about war, a peace and war. But unfortunately, the people talking about it at the time put wish ahead of practicalities. Then things all change when we get to the Second War, and 1939-45, idealism is proved wrong, but luckily there's a new paradigm that can move up, emerges as a pragmatic alternative, and that is classical realism. And classical realism gets the crisis of the 20th century right. Realism, in terms of its classical form, sees the laws of history rooted in human nature, and therefore there are limits to the possible, limits to what we can do because of issues around power and power politics. So we have to kind of lower our sights. The problem with this expected story is, to quote Blackadder, that it's complete and utter bollocks. The first two counts are wrong. The third count isn't wrong, but it does play an important role in terms of the reason why we didn't spot the vote on constructor fleet coming in. So what do I mean about these ones being wrong? Well, first off, it's rather interesting that idealism exists as a concept at all. And it's something I have actually sort of written on as well, because it actually doesn't really exist. Well, it does exist. There's idealism in philosophy. You can talk about German idealism, but in an international relations sense, there really is no such thing as idealism. What's largely happened is that realists have been allowed to make their own antithesis, their own image, their own opposite. I was at the ISA recently, and someone was talking about realism in Chinese conceptions of order, and he said, "Well, there's lots of examples of realism in Chinese writing. There's also examples of idealism, and so that's all the things that are not realism." But he said, "Look, the problem with this is that idealism, in many respects." As a kind of a created opposite. Any created opposite also carries through the silences and the failures of perception of those that create it. And in many respects, idealism shares, as a concept within realism, shares a lot with realism itself. One of those is its sort of anti-materialism. It's not a materialist theory, and its second is it's ahistorical, much as realism is ahistorical, despite its concept of laws of human history. So that's the first issue, is that they've created their own enemy, and I'll come back to that later. The other issue with it is it really doesn't really get a handle on what international thought looked like pre-1950. And I think the important thing is, I'll try to explain a little bit later of why this happened. But pre-1950, there is an amazing plurality of international thought. And in some respects, current kind of histories of international thought and historical accounts are really scratching the surface of the options here. We've done fairly good at getting to grips with British and American variations of this, but there's a whole kind of world out there of a very diverse international thought. And amongst these are two, which I think actually in many respects become kind of dominant approaches when people were looking at the international in the tail end of the 19th century and in the early 20th century. And that's political economy and political geography. In fact, I have, rather tongue-in-cheek, I'm not sure if it's totally true, but there's a case of deliberate overstatement at one point, actually claimed that international relations before the Second World War was international political economy. There's a lot of political economy approaches. There's also something here in terms of the dates that we're talking about, and this comes back to the criticism of 1919 as an origin date, is that the big explosion in the interest in the international comes with works published towards the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, where the interest is in how, particularly the second industrial revolution, how the kind of these major changes have disturbed the international system. You can see this in sort of Paul Reinish's book, World Politics, where he's writing quite pessimistically. In some respects, he seems to fit into a sort of a power political mode, but he's kind of, in some respects, talking about a world that's died, this world where agrarian societies could safely ignore each other. Now, with interdependence, all these societies now have their hands in each other's pockets, and that creates more violence, it creates more imperial conquests, it creates tensions. So a lot of international relations emerges as trying to solve the problems of industrialization of the second industrial revolution and of the late 19th century. So you know, it's before 1919. You know, I don't want to make this though just a criticism of classical realism, because actually I quite like a lot of classical realism, and some of the classical realist works are actually really very useful and very interesting and intriguing. But I think there's a point in which realism is very useful, despite the kind of the claims about speaking ahistorically for all things for all time, classical realism, particularly from 1950 onwards, does a very good job of answering an immediate problem. And that immediate problem is thermonuclear war. And the immediate problem is the Cold War. And they do a good job of it. They do a good job of it by trying to simplify things down. They're asking questions like, how can ideological rivals, the United States and the Soviet Union, who obviously ideologically hate each other's guts, how can they reach a kind of a modus vivendi that will prevent us all dying? And you know, it's not for nothing that Morgenthau's Politics Among Nations is subtitled the politics of power and peace. Peace is very important for the classical realists. I try to keep it alive. And in some respects, there's a certain family resemblance with reason of state theories emerging in the 16th century, where again you have a kind of an ideologically split world, in this case on confessional basis, well, world, you mean Europe here. And people like Giovanni Botero, people like Justus Lipsius are looking for ways that Calvinists, Lutherans, Catholics can talk to each other. And the best way to do that is to stop thinking in terms of religion and start thinking in terms of power, get people to talk about power. And of course, you know, this is particularly well explored, I think, in Reinhold Niebuhr's work. Anyway, more on that later. And actually, I think, you know, this is the problem with this kind of realism-idealism split, that when you look back, as people like Nicola Gilo have done, to the debates of the late 40s, the 50s, the conferences that are being organized, what we find with classical realism is that its enemy is not idealism. You read these conference reports, they're not worried about idealists. What they're worried about is scientism. And what they're particularly worried about is the great evil itself, political science. Because they've been thrown into political science departments. So it's scientism they're worried about. This, I think, is also linked to a large degree why we see them also attacking materialist approaches, earlier materialist approaches, particularly the political geographers. Morgenthau demolishes political geographers in Politics Among Nations in less than 2 pages. You know, it's just like, let's not even bother with them. He only mentions 3, I think. And none of which were Americans, interesting enough. Well, anyway, so the real enemy is scientism, and this is why I sort of just want to talk here about.
Just don't tweak the anchor.
Is it because where I am?
Yeah. So.
Yeah, sure. Sorry about this.
There you go.
Is that okay?
I think so.
That bar seems to still be there. There you go. Okay, good. It still doesn't work. It still doesn't like it. Ah.
It should work.
Yeah, that's it. That's great. And linked to this, of course, is kind of the disciplinary history here, what kind of happens in not after the Second World War, because realism doesn't actually emerge successfully out of the Second World War. It's really much later when we're looking at the particularly from 1950, and it's the realist capture of international relations as it gets in the American Academy absorbed into political science, and the transition to university-led study of international relations. And this leads, I'm going to mix metaphors here, because I'm going to start off with mass extinction. This leads to a mass extinction event. There's a lot of international thought that never makes the leap from the pre-1950 international thought into the academy. It's a very small amount that survives into it. There's a mass extinction. There's also a marginalization of empire. And again, you do see that shift then to the idea that international relations begin with 1919. There are a whole other, I haven't got time to go into this in great detail, but there are a whole other issues there in terms of that Bob Vitalis has done good work on in terms of what that means in terms of race. But I would, and this is why I'm mixing the metaphors, mass extinctions, heroic ages. I would argue that in many respects, and this is in many respects the success of classical realism as an approach, is that it's heroic age literature. And the thing about heroic age literature, heroic myths, is they have an enormous amount of sustaining power. You know, Plato complains about it in the Republic. It's heroic age literature because it presents a sort of a tragedy of strict moral constraints. And I use moral deliberately here because the classical realists are concerned with ethics. It's a tragedy of strict moral constraints caught within a kind of a moral iron cage. In this case, it's the moral iron cage of power politics and how we deal with that. It's ahistorical. I mean, it's interested in the laws of history, but the way the laws of history are presented are actually ahistorical. It's immediate problems, in this case, the Cold War, thermonuclear war, wrapped up in timeless truths. So what we're looking at here is a kind of heroic age literature, and it survives kind of as heroic age literature as it keeps being reproduced in international relations. But that's the point as well, is that when we're looking at this, when we're looking at the history of international relations as a discipline, is actually the classical realists failed. They only actually are dominant for a very short space of time. And in fact, people who work on classical realists, people like Sean Malloy, for example, will say exactly that. The classical realists are actually marginalized very quickly because they largely failed against the political scientists. They tried to create this refugia where they could have sort of power political, ethical, and philosophical debate. But what happens with the development of political science is that we see that the more kind of formal modeling and also the quantitative, the behavioral revolution, as it was called, comes into international relations. But what survives is the basic ideas of realism. So you get a kind of a sort of development of what later on would be called neo-realism, but a sort of a more structural realism. But it's taken a lot of the heroic age stories, but it's repackaged it in a scientific way. There's sort of the multiple ironies of the IR discipline, and it's that, I argue, that leads us to this laws of history through human nature approach, blinds us to the ecological existential threats that were to come later. It gave us really good tools for dealing with thermonuclear war, but at the expense of not being able to see something that was really building. And some of you may have seen these graphs before. It's from Will Stefan et al. This is the Vogon constructor fleet coming in, because they spotted it. They were actually given the job of trying to find where they should begin the Anthropocene. It was Crutzen, I think, who said, look, it's probably somewhere at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So they put their graphs to 1750. And when the information came through, it was like, oh my God, 1950. And of course, later on, they were to call this the Great Acceleration. And, you know, Regan quoted Bukharin in his paper there about Bukharin saying we don't have to worry about geopolitics because these are, quote, relatively constant factors. You know, what this graph is showing is that actually, now at least, Bukharin is wrong. That what we're seeing now is the socioeconomic trends are now driving Earth system, trends in Earth system as well. And thus, you know, what we kind of miss is humans becoming a force of nature, and that the ecology suddenly becomes a deeply political issue. And unlike Bukharin, we can no longer ignore it because it is no longer constant. And there is a great irony that the triumph of classical realism is 1950 and the beginning, but as they triumph, the Vogon constructor fleet was already passing over their heads. You know, this leads in some respects to this kind of the Great Acceleration. Is an irony that industrialization leads to the birth of international relations and international thought as a kind of a field, but we kind of missed what happened, the trend that happened after 1950, after that, and the creation of a human planet, which has major implications for international relations. That the irony, as I put it in my paper there, that decades of realist framing of global political problems restricted reality to what was in our natures rather than what we were doing to nature, and the importance here of perception, which is what I want to talk about in the second part. This is a little bit more tentative. I'm trying to reconstruct a lost materialist tradition as it kind of existed both before, but also kind of continued through as a hidden history during kind of the international relations post-war. There's kind of three things that I try to sort of reconstruct. One is something that actually has been reinvented. And this is the idea of that we really now have to see politics in 4 dimensions, 3 dimensions plus time. And you've got a lot of works in geography on this, thinking particularly of Stephen Graham's book, Vertical, for example. Interestingly enough, Stephen Graham, really good book, really enjoyed it. Never once quotes the geographer Derwent Whittlesey, who wrote about this in 1945. Because, of course, I've done it again, because, of course, yeah, these are not, this is not actually a new idea. This is, this idea of a kind of a 4-dimensional world in the machine age comes from Derwent Whittlesey's 1945 address to the Association of American Geographers, which was inspired in turn by probably the sort of the big name in the sort of the history of human geography, Ellen Churchill Semple, who's now pretty much out of fashion. And the crucial thing about Whittlesey's view of the world, and he's talking about machine age. So here is someone sort of writing about international relations who's kind of associated with Yale, and was actually there at the foundation of international relations, but lived long enough to see international relations ditch political geography and completely ignore it. But the crucial thing for him was the Industrial Revolution, or what he called the machine age. And Whittlesey's arguments are that the world before the machine age, when we were farmers, when you were farming, we would argue, you know, you only have to see in 2 dimensions. There's a bit more to this argument than I'm giving here. It's a very long paper, but just bear with me on this one. So we see the world in 2 dimensions, and it is with the machine age as we break into the vertical, where we start using the atmosphere, the deep oceans, we did the deep mines, we use radar and radio waves, we use aircraft, we use tunnels, that we suddenly open up this 3rd dimension, which is invisible to anyone who has a geography that only has 2 dimensions. So this was his argument. And I often think about this one when I see latest book coming out in international relations. It kind of worries me how many publishers think that a chessboard is a good representation of international relations. Now, don't get me wrong, I love chess. I was in the chess club at school. I was number 5 on the chess ladder out of 16. I like chess, but it doesn't help me with international relations. A sort of a square, flat, solid board with solid pieces. It's the 2-dimensional pre-machine age world. But the crucial thing, I think, for Whittlesey is not the 3rd dimension so much as the development of the 4th dimension of time, the speeding up of time, the velocity of the machine age. For Whittlesey, the most important thing for him is the use of resources increases faster than they can be replaced. The big, Grace Viking in 1945, the big issue for Whittlesey is the Midwest Dust Bowl, which for him epitomized the problem that humanity faced, one of the big political geography problems. He was also a historical geographer, because again, it gets the link we have between space and time, history and geography. In terms of thinking about this, I just sort of taking a tiny detour here, is that I feel that in some respects, Whittlesey is writing before the Great Acceleration, is writing about what industrialization is doing. But there's an aspect in which Whittlesey's concept of the 3rd and 4th dimensions could help us kind of link up with the new field of discard studies. We tend to waste in the 3rd dimension. Where do we put our garbage? The solution to pollution is dilution. We stick it in the sea, we stick it in the air, we bury it underground, we try to get rid of it. We export it to poorer countries. We try to get rid of it, out of sight, out of mind. So it's in the 3rd dimension, but also it runs up against the 4th dimension in the sense that this kind of pollution and waste, of course, is gallery speak. I don't want to talk about microplastics. But anyway, so I mean, there is, I think, a possibility for international relations talking rubbish. I think because there's a friend of mine who's in geography. He works on mining, and there's a joke in that. It's a very sick joke. There's a joke in the mining sector that mining is really a waste management industry because it's the biggest thing it produces is waste. Not what they're mining. It's easy to ignore waste, but also waste, and this sort of fits in with sort of IPE approaches. Waste and understanding waste is a great way to make visible politico-economic power. Once you start seeing the lines of waste rather than the lines of global finance and trade, you suddenly see in very stark details the global division of labour. So anyway, just one possible way. The second one is, and apologies to Ben and Howard, I just recently presented on Elizabeth Manville-Jaycee at NUPE. I'll keep it short, guys, don't worry. Here's Elizabeth Manville-Jaycee. She's writing in the second half of the 20th century, but taking a very materialist approach. And I don't think many people in international relations, despite the fact she taught 2 IR courses at Dalhousie University, don't really know her. She famously pointed out that 71% of the Earth's surface is oceans. Also pointing out that by an interesting quirk of coincidence, humans are 71% salty water. So we kind of mirror the Earth in that. And 99% by volume of life's habitat is in the oceans. She also took a sort of 3-dimensional view, just like Whittlesey. I think, important here is the issue, there's often criticisms of international relations being very parochial, and quite clearly it is. That kind of need for the international relations to engage with parts of the world it never engages with. But international relations has a tendency to only look at 29% of the Earth's surface and 1% of where life lives on Earth. The oceans just do not appear, except in Ben and Halbert's book on the sea and international relations. I argue as well that international relations theories tend to be, they always all are, linked to solid land and to living on terra firma. It's solid land, it's about states with fixed boundaries, with clear state sovereignty, and when the seas are mentioned, they're either a place of transit or, in the famous words of John Mersheimer, the stopping power of water. The water is rather than something else. And I think one of the things that's good about Borghese is that she kind of opens that box up. I use the term hangar-shore IR. How much do I have time to explain this kind of thing? Hangar-shore IR, because it's actually from where I live in Newfoundland, which looks to the sea. They have this phrase hangar-shore. Hangar-shore means a useless person. And this is a fish, traditionally fishing and sealing communities. And if you can't work on the sea, you're useless. You're a hangar-shore. And I argue that a lot of IR theory is really hangar-shore IR. Don't click the button. Yeah, I just have to do this, don't I? Yay, I'm independent. But what worried Borghese particularly was that technology is increasingly making the exploitation of the oceans possible, which is why she was heavily involved in UNCLOS 3, the law of the sea, to try and regulate and control the exploitation of the oceans, and was involved with the common heritage of humanity, the common heritage of mankind ideas that entered into UNCLOS 3. Just quickly, in terms of her views of the ocean, for her, the ocean was a different medium. It forces us to rethink. Everything flows. That's nothing original. Grotius said the same thing to defend the rights of freedom of the seas. But she adds, everything is also connected in the oceans. She adds as well the growing importance of oceans as sources of wealth. I think in some respects, it wasn't as, we weren't as far advanced on the technologies as she thought at the time. But, it still remains a kind of a possibility in that. The damage also done by applying terrestrial paradigms to the sea, the pollution, that we lose the sea as both a larder and a midden simultaneously, and the dangers of private over-exploitation that she tried to deal with through her advocacy in UNCLOS 3. And she asked us to do two things. One of them is to rethink the ocean regime, rethink how we manage the ocean with new paradigms, but also suggests that the ocean also acts as a kind of a template for maybe us thinking about a world, particularly where our own terra firma seems to, in some respects, becoming as flowed and connected as the oceans already are, that in fact, ways that we might use to manage this very different medium of the sea might have applicability in the age of climate chaos. Hangar-shore international relations. Look how the maps on the front are all about the land, spot the sea. Sometimes it's just, where's the ocean there? Anyway, so the bottom line here is the importance of seeing the ocean as well as part of international relations and of global politics. And I'm bad at this. I can do it now myself, I think. Yeah, I've learned. Here we go. It's because I'm holding it in my hand. Yeah. And so we've got to have Monty Python since we had we've already had Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Yeah, global politics needs to get its basically. And the last one, and I'll just do this one quite briefly, and I'd be willing to answer any questions about as well, is process over goals. It's something actually that comes up in a recent book by Dryzak and Pickering on the politics of the Anthropocene. They said with a regime of no normal, we're going to have to start thinking about very responsive governance that is more about process and goals, because goals don't make so much sense when you're dealing with a kind of a reality that's shifting, when you're dealing with liquefaction in your political world. And again, really interesting idea, but it's not new. You can find exactly the same thing in the works of Mary Parker Follett and David Matrani in their functional approach. both of which, of course, were dealing with the problems of industrialization and saw themselves very much as doing that in the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. And so it's an unwitting return to the functional approach. I won't talk too much more about that, other than to show you a picture of liquefaction. You know, this is what happens to our solid realities when we strike a sort of an ecological crisis. But I do want to sort of summarize part two and then go on to the conclusion. Is a kind of sort of, we have to sort of think, if we're going to think about reconstructing a materialist tradition in international relations, about changing perceptions. And here I really kind of focused on a materialist global politics that sees in 4 dimensions, sees the oceans, and puts processes before goals. Which leads me to the conclusion. And I want to look back from the 22nd century. And the reason I want to do that is because I recently published in this thing, which was a lot of fun to do. It's actually an anti-handbook. They did it as more of a spoof of handbooks. And it was at the Palgrave Handbook of Global Politics in the 22nd century. What would the 22nd century say, looking back at us? Or at least that was the theme of my chapter. My contribution was a review of a chapter in 2123 in a handbook that was looking at the history of international relations. And the review was written by Dr. Secunda Sensa, which is, I varied it a bit, so it's not the exact Latin translation. And then also there is no direct Latin translation for a reviewer, because they didn't have our system of measuring academic excellence. But it basically means second review. It's slightly not, but anyway. But the crucial thing about the world that I kind of constructed in 21-23, looking back at the world in 2023, was that unfortunately they hadn't listened to me at all. I get used to that, and they still divided theories into realist and idealist, despite all my warnings not to. But and this was the twist that slowly emerges from the review. The realists were now considered the political economists and political geographers who saw the Anthropocene crisis coming. And the idealists were those we now call realists. So I kind of reversed it in a kind of, yes, it's a satire. It was a sort of a political science fiction satire. The important point, though, from this is, in some respects, realism is what we need to see. You know, if what we need to see the crisis is a particular approach, then I argue that that actually is realistic and a realistic approach. So, creating a materialist tradition out of 20th century IR so that we don't have to continually reinvent the wheel, because a lot of these ideas have come up already in one form or another. So basically then my conclusion is that what I've been trying to do here is retelling a history of international thought that reclaims a materialist tradition and retools our perception of global politics for a new age of no normal. And let's hope it helps us to keep our eye out for those both on constructive things. Thank you.